Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, I'm going to be interviewing U.S. Congressman, U.S. Representative Rodney Davis. He is the ranking Republican member of a House subcommittee that's coming to the state of North Dakota to talk about our voter ID laws. Now, you'll hear that interview later, but I want to talk a little bit about this situation before we get to it, because I have a feeling that this subcommittee is going to be making a lot of headlines. And in fact, I think that's probably the whole point of the subcommittee, is to make headlines. You see, the issue they're coming to investigate, that they're coming to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, and it's a Democratic-led subcommittee. In fact, there's just one Republican member of the committee, my guest later in the program. And all of these so far, and maybe they're going to add more panelists and more witnesses to the hearing, but and that's what this is called. This is called a field hearing of the subcommittee. It's not a full committee meeting. It's a field hearing. So that means they don't necessarily have to abide by some of the rules that Washington sets for having a quorum and things like that. They can do field hearings. And a lot of times these field hearings turn into political stunts. And that's what I'm afraid is going to be happening here in the state of North Dakota. You see, during the 2018 election cycle, we heard a lot about North Dakota's voter ID laws. Now, it doesn't matter that these voter ID laws, the most recent iteration has been in place since the 2017 legislative session. It doesn't matter that we had plenty of time for the reservations, to get to reservation communities to get prepared to comply with the law. It doesn't matter that this was, in fact, the law was challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. And while the Supreme Court has not yet weighed in on the constitutionality, they did decline to enjoin the law, which is to say, prevent it from being enforced. In fact, they were asked to step in and stop the state of North Dakota from enforcing the law. They allowed it to go forward. So this law has been vetted by the courts, not fully, but at least to enough degree where they're comfortable allowing it to be enforced. And yet the political talking point during the 2018 election was that this law was suppressing the vote. In fact, it was such a political talking point, it was reported by many in the media as though it were fact, as though it was just part of the landscape. North Dakota was suppressing Native American votes. Now, I thought that was a shameful thing. For one thing, this law is easily complied with. North Dakota has some of the easiest voting laws in the country. You don't even have to register to vote in North Dakota. All you have to do is make sure that you have an ID, and that the ID is tied to an updated address in the state's database. The residency requirements are as easy as pie. You just have to have been living where you're living, where you want to vote at, for 30 days before the election. That's it. None of this, registering months ahead of time or any of that stuff that you have to do in other states. That's it. It is easy, very easy in North Dakota. And yet some would make it sound like we're trying to, disenfranchise entire segments of the population. It's just not true. But it's good politics, which is the point. See, it was good politics for the Democrats in the middle of a hotly contested U.S. Senate race between Kevin Cramer and Heidi Heitkamp to say, the Republicans are trying to suppress the Native American vote. And then they got all these left-wing groups, coming into the states. And then they have all the national media reporters who are sympathetic to left-wing causes coming into the states to write stories about the talking points and to be dismissive of any sort of rebuttal or factual information, people here in North Dakota might give in response. And the hell of it is, at the end of it all, voter turnout in North Dakota's Native American communities set records in 2018. It was extremely high. If our voter ID laws were intended to suppress the vote, boy, did they do a poor job, because the vote got out in a big way. Now, some argue and say, well, Port, that's only because we had all these groups that had to come here and they had to fight the state and they had to get all these people to the polls and they had to, really do all this heavy lifting to get the vote out. And I mean, that's not wrong. There certainly were plenty of groups on the reservation, but to me, all that shows is that the law was easily complied with. Right? I mean, once you disseminate information about the law, once people understand what they have to do, getting them to do it is not really that hard. The Native American vote turned out for Heidi Heitkamp in a big way. And so as far as that goes, that political stunt worked, right? Because that was the whole goal. The reservation communities, Indian country, I guess, is a term a lot of people use, including our Native American friends themselves. They, typically vote Democratic in a big way. Usually the Indian, the Native American communities are, little spots of blue on North Dakota's mostly red electoral map. Heidi Heitkamp wanted to get those votes out. Democrats wanted to get those votes out in 2018 because they thought they were going to need them. Now, Heitkamp lost by a wide margin anyway, and so it ultimately decided not to have been decisive, but in a closer election, those reservation votes could have mattered. In fact, they did matter in 2012. But here's what worries me is making these sorts of wild-eyed accusations, and then after the fact, even perpetuating this idea that, we're out to suppress votes, I think is so hurtful to our ability to get along. I mean, we obviously struggle with a cultural divide, a political divide, an economic divide between our reservation communities, our Native American communities in North Dakota and the rest of the state. It's a hard thing. There's a lot of fraught history there, a lot of ugly history. And it's not easy to get along. And what frustrates me is when I see politicians manipulating that history to satisfy modern political goals. Heidi Heitkamp wanted to get reelected to the United States Senate, and so she had absolutely no problem with hammering on that wedge between Indian country and the rest of the state. I think a better sort of leader would try to bridge those sort of gaps, but unfortunately, there are fewer of those sorts of leaders in our political landscape. Instead, we have people that want to exploit those gaps, people like Heidi Heitkamp. And don't get me wrong, plenty of Republicans do it as well. It's just frustrating, and it's ugly, and it's not taking us any place that solves our problems. My interview with Congressman Rodney Davis, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Joining me now is U.S. Representative, ranking member of what is a new subcommittee. It's the Committee on House Administration's Subcommittee on Elections. Representative Rodney Davis is the ranking Republican member on the subcommittee, and Representative Davis, you're the ranking member because you're also the only Republican member on this subcommittee. And you folks are going to be coming to North Dakota very soon to talk about elections and voter ID. Thanks for your time. Tell us what's going on.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to coming to North Dakota. It'll be my first time in the great state of North Dakota, and I've been very impressed with my colleague and friend who's now moved over to the Senate, Kevin Kramer. He and I got elected together in 2012. He did a great job on behalf of North Dakotans, and I'm really excited to get to work with your new congressman, Kelly Armstrong. Kelly's doing a great job already, making a name for himself. And I like to go travel to states to kind of see, the constituencies that my colleagues represent. And this election subcommittee is going to give me a chance to do that. The election subcommittee is a brand new subcommittee as part of the smallest whole committee in the House. It's the Committee on House Administration. I'm the lead Republican on the Committee on House Administration, the full committee. And also, as you said, the only Republican on the election subcommittee, which was set up at the behest of Nancy Pelosi and my good friend Marcia Fudge, who's the chair of the subcommittee. We're looking, we're going around the nation right now, looking for examples of individuals who may not have had access to being able to vote on a regular basis. But at the same time, what I'm trying to do is continue the process of making sure that any Voting Rights Act reauthorization bill that goes through Congress is bipartisan, just like they've been in the past. Every Voting Rights Act bill that has passed the House of Representatives before I was born, before you were born, and as recently as the mid-2000s has been bipartisan. And that's my goal, is to keep it that way.
Now, obviously, you folks are coming to North Dakota and to the Standing Rock Reservation specifically because we have had a fight going on over North Dakota's voter ID law. Now, during the 2018 election, this became a hot political topic. We had national reporters parachuting into North Dakota in the closing day because we had you mentioned Senator Kevin Kramer, your former colleague in the House, It was he was in one of the he and then incumbent Heidi Heitkamp were in one of the hottest congressional races in the country. I mean, all eyes were looking at this. It ended up being a big pickup for Republicans. But in the weeks leading up to the election, we saw a lot of coverage on this idea that North Dakota's voter ID law was going to be suppressing the Native American vote. And I imagine that's why you folks are coming here. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of North Dakotans who are scratching their heads over this for two reasons. One, we don't have voter registration in North Dakota. In fact, we're the only state in the nation that doesn't have voter registration. And, to our minds, not only does that make it extremely easy to vote, it also makes the voter ID all the more important. When you show up at the polls, you're not registered or anything. So show us an ID, just prove that you're living in the district, in the precinct where you're voting, and then cast your ballot. I mean, to us, this seems very simple. Our law was the U.S. Supreme Court had a chance to enjoin it, to block it from being enforced before the election. A majority of the Supreme Court justices declined. They allowed the law to go forward, which is not upholding it constitutionally, but certainly they didn't see enough problems to enjoin it, to stop it from being enforced. Also, we saw Native American turnout in North Dakota set records in the 2018 election. So I think a lot of us are thinking, where's the problem? I mean, what is the subcommittee coming to look at?
Well, I concur. There are a lot of issues that you just brought up that need to be brought up during this subcommittee process, during this hearing. I'm not too sure that the majority members that are on the committee are going to want to hear witnesses that would actually refer to some of the policies that you just referred to, because it's crucial. If you don't have a set registration process, like many of us who live in different states take for granted, you have to look at making sure that people who are voting in the state of North Dakota are actually residents of North Dakota. These issues, voter ID issues, unfortunately, they get turned into issues of voter suppression. And I just don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. The biggest threat to elections and fair elections is partisanship, not state legislators putting forth policies that work in their states better than others. It's partisanship. And I think the citizens of North Dakota saw that with national reporters coming in right before the election of a very important election that helped determine the control of the U.S. Senate, where my good friend Kevin Cramer won, and I'm glad for that. But they came in and I'm sure in many cases, obfuscated what the registration process was in North Dakota. So part of what I'm going to do is to bring up many of the issues that you talked about.
Give us some of the give us some examples. I mean, what exactly are we going to hear? Because I'm looking at, I got a press release from the committee about a week ago, talking about some of the witnesses and who's going to be on the panel. I mean, one of the witnesses is a community organizer who is a Democratic activist. In fact, ran for the state legislature as a Democratic candidate not that long ago. The other is an attorney for a group that has sued North Dakota over its voter ID laws. A member of the panel is a co-executive director for Four Directions, which was a Native American voter rights group that worked very closely with Democratic Senate candidates during the last election. Is there any? I mean, those. I don't have a problem with any of those people being involved in the process and having their voices heard. They have every right to have that. I'm just wondering, where's the other side of the argument? Are there more witnesses added at this point that aren't on this press release?
Well, that's yet to be determined. But in the end, we don't set the agenda. Remember, unfortunately, Republicans lost the majority in the House. We lost too many seats, and unfortunately, Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House. So we don't get to determine the agenda. We don't get to determine how hearings are set up. And in many cases, we don't get to determine what those witnesses are going to be able to discuss. I think it's pretty obvious, though. I think it's pretty obvious that the message that we're going to hear from some of these witnesses is going to be a much more partisan message. And I sincerely hope that their testimony does not reflect that, because as I said earlier, the biggest threat to fair elections in this country is partisanship. And the last thing I want to see in a subcommittee hearing in my first visit to North Dakota ever is a bunch of partisan folks who are engaged in the election process, whose only goal is to elect one side over the other. Because that's not what these subcommittee hearings should be about. That's not a good use of taxpayer dollars.
Last week, but we're recording this podcast on Friday. This will be airing Monday before the committee hearing, which is taking place on Tuesday, April 16th, the day after tax day, as it happens. I talked with Senator Kramer about this previously when he was on this podcast. And, I asked him about this. And one thing that he wanted to make clear, and I want to make clear as well, is if this subcommittee reveals real problems with North Dakota's voter ID laws, I'm completely open to fixing those. I don't want it to be hard to vote. I don't want it to be hard for people to legally vote. I want it to be just as easy as we can possibly make it. My problem is that there seems to be an attitude among some that there shouldn't be any requirement to identify yourselves at all. North Dakota is a very down-home place. I will tell you, the last time I voted, Rodney, the guy who took my ballot, or who gave me my ballot, I should say, was my old high school gym teacher. So, there's a lot of that going on. It used to be that you could vouch for people at the polls, say, oh yeah, that's my neighbor, and then you could vote. There was a lot of that going on. I just don't think in 2019, when we have, available all these communications methods where, unfortunately, I think make organizing fraud easier, our ballots can't be that vulnerable, right? And I'm afraid there's some people that just don't care that much about that.
Well, that's very frustrating. I'll be honest with you. Your concerns and Senator Kramer's concerns and Congressman Armstrong's concerns are very valuable in this debate. That's why I'm coming to North Dakota, because I want to be there as a voice of reason, as a voice of the Republican Party to show that we need balance. We need less partisanship in our elections. Elections have never been easier to participate in the history of our country. We've seen historic turnout. The turnout in North Dakota alone from 2016 to 2018 increased in a midterm, or compared to the last midterm, by 15 points. So more people, hundreds of thousands more got a chance to vote there, and in states like my home state of Illinois. Look, you can make as many jokes about the state of Illinois about who gets to vote and how long they've lived or not lived. But it's unfortunate that my home state has had to deal with these issues. We have counties in my home state where more people are registered to vote than actually were counted in the census. And that's something that the Democrats in Washington, they pushed a bill through the House of Representatives already that I stood up and my colleagues stood up and fought against, that would have ensured that every county in the nation had more people registered to vote than who would have been counted in the census. They wanted the national takeover of our election process instead of allowing a state like yours to be able to have somebody vouch for their neighbor. That's not what we want in Washington. That's not what the American people have clamored for. And that's why I hope my presence, listening to some of the witnesses, and then really, I think the witnesses' testimonies is going to sell them, their ideas are going to write their own stories. And I certainly hope that it's not a political rally. And I certainly hope that it's an engagement that we can see some bipartisanship on.
Tell me, as a practical matter, because I hope too it's not a political rally, but I'm curious, what can this subcommittee do? They come to North Dakota. I'm assuming they're going to be holding hearings in other parts of the country as well. But they come to North Dakota, they hear all this testimony. What can they do? This is the state voter ID law, and obviously it's subject to review by the courts and the federal courts, and in fact was by the U.S. Supreme Court before the last election. So as a practical matter, what can this subcommittee do? If they come out, they hear the testimony, what action can you take?
They've already taken action that would affect North Dakota. The Democrats introduced a 500 and some odd page bill, H.R. 1, on the day we were sworn in, January 3rd. They stood up and bragged at a press conference and got every single Democrat in Congress to co-sponsor this bill. They bragged about writing it in secret with Democrat special interest groups. They bragged about it. And then they passed this bill as one of the first partisan pieces of legislation that we had in the House of Representatives this year. They passed it. And what it would lead to is your registration or your lack of registration system, your voting system in North Dakota, as you know it, would cease to exist. If this bill passes the Senate and is signed into law, which thankfully we have Mitch McConnell as a buffer in the Senate, and also President Trump. If this passed, your voting process in North Dakota would completely change and be run by Washington, D.C. And also, let me tell you, part of that bill, which became 600 and some odd pages after amendments, the bill would allow for your taxpayer dollars to fund every single congressional campaign in the nation. Look, I've run for office now 4 times and won. I don't think I've heard anyone, Republican or Democrat, tell me the best way to get money out of politics is to actually have your tax dollars going to my campaign instead.
Let me just get this straight, would you? Because I'm a little wowed by something you just said. We're holding the hearings now, but they've already written and passed the legislation?
They've already written and passed the legislation that would actually effectively change the way North Dakota's voting registration.
So do they really care what anybody in North Dakota has to say about this?
Well, I give a lot of credit to my colleague Marcia Fudge, who chairs the subcommittee. I think that the election subcommittee wants to focus on the Voting Rights Act. And the Supreme Court recently ruled that the Voting Rights Act needs to be updated, and I certainly hope it's updated in the House. But judging by the witnesses that you just mentioned, I doubt there's going to be as much discussion on Voting Rights Act than it will be on the processes that North Dakotans use to be able to verify that somebody lives in a certain area in a certain precinct and is able or not able to cast their vote. Yeah. And if that's the discussion point, then yes, the House of Representatives, the Democrats rammed through on a completely partisan vote a direct takeover of our nation's election system by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. that would also include the first ever corporate money and taxpayer money going into congressional campaigns. Every member of Congress, every Democrat who voted for this bill, and it was all of them, just voted to line their own pockets, their own campaign coffers with tax dollars and corporate money for the first time ever.
Well, we're almost at the end of the time you have available today, and I certainly thank you for that time. This is important stuff, and I think a lot of times we get caught up in who's going to win the Senate election or who's going to win, who's going to get North Dakota's presidential. Although we haven't given them to a Democrat since like the Lyndon administration, so I'm not sure. That's usually not in play, but still, if you drill down to the local level, though, we have legislative races, and in North Dakota, odd number districts get elected one cycle, even number districts get elected the next cycle. Well, if you live in an area and you can drive across town, like maybe there's no legislative district, you drive across town and you vote in an odd number district because even numbers are up that year, or however it works out. Sometimes these legislative races are settled by dozens of votes. Right? I mean, I wish turnout was higher for these legislative races, but sometimes it's dozens of votes. It wouldn't be that hard to change who represents a legislative district and change, the majority minority structure of the state legislature by people just driving across town, which is why it's important to know where the people who are voting that they're qualified to vote there. I mean, this is otherwise, I guess we should just elect all the legislators at large, and we can have all the lawmakers be from Grand Forks and Fargo, and then that'll just be that, because if we're gonna have these lines, we're gonna draw these lines, we got to know where people vote. So I'll let you just wrap up. Anything else you want to say about this subcommittee, and I'll let you go. And certainly thank you for your time.
Well, I appreciate the time. I actually want to address the concerns you just brought up, because you and I both know the majority of people who cast their vote in any election are not partisan hacks. They're the ones that just want to go have their voice be heard. They want to walk in, cast their vote, and they want to walk out, and they want that election that they participated in to be determined fairly and have a fair outcome. But you just mentioned many races, including mine. Heck, I won by 1,002 votes my first race. That's less than 2 votes per precinct in my district. But there's enough partisan hacks out there in every state that can determine and change the outcome of an election that is as close as the one that I've experienced in my past. These are the types of things that we have to watch out for. We can't encourage activity like that to happen. And that's what I hope a message is that gets out to the public in North Dakota. Get engaged in this process. Come to this Starved Rock hearing. Come listen to the testimony that the Democrats have arranged. We don't get a say in how these hearings are run any longer, because we're not in the majority. And if you feel you want your voice to be heard, come listen to the voices that the Democrats are wanting everybody to hear.
Representative Davis, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And tell Kevin and Kelly I said hello, and thanks for representing us, representing North Dakota so well in Washington. They do a phenomenal job.
I'll certainly do that, sir. Thank you.
Take care.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday right away in the morning. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, we should be on all the platforms out there: Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, of course. If you're finding a place where this podcast isn't listed, shoot me an email, rob@sayanythingblog.com, and let me know. If you see a place where you can leave a rating or a review for this podcast, that always helps us out, helps more people find it. If you would leave an honest one, I would appreciate it. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.